As you've probably noticed, there's 2 names on the slide, and there's only 1 person here. Unfortunately, Amelia couldn't be here today, so you've just got me up here in person, but this talk is a product of both of our work and both of our experiences. I'm Betsy. I'll introduce us both properly in a minute. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge that we meet today on the traditional lands of the Ugambe people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. When making decisions and designing systems using human data, often people will look at individual fields or individual pieces of data and ask, is this private or public? If the answer is it's public, the data is usually then considered by many to be fair game for usage, sharing, whatever you want to do with it. Of course, we've seen many cases where this has had disastrous consequences. I don't want to spend the time going into all of the examples of terribleness because we've talked about that a lot, and I'm sure you can all think of examples, but if you want one thing to hold in your head to know what I'm talking about, think about Cambridge Analytica. If you're not convinced that this is an important thing to be talking about right now, watch Lana's talk from yesterday at the Security Mini Conference. She conveys that much better than I could. We've all seen disasters that happen when people don't think through privacy properly. We know that a lot of these data systems can cause harm and make us and others uncomfortable. In order to learn how to handle data systems better, we need to spend some time exploring the idea of privacy. So, as I said, this talk is a product of both of our experiences. So, Amelia is an ethnographer and socio-cultural anthropologist at the University of Queensland Centre for Policy Futures. Her research specializes in the socio-economic and political implications of emerging technologies, particularly in the criminal justice system. I'm a back-end software engineer focusing on data infrastructure. Years ago, I did some work in computational linguistics and artificial intelligence, but I now work in research infrastructure, building platforms and processes to support researchers using dynamic digital data. There are a lot of words that get thrown around in all of these discussions around data and privacy and so on. So many different terms from so many different fields. Amelia and I particularly notice this because we're from very different fields. We talk about this a lot. We're housemates. We live together, and we talk about privacy and data over breakfast in the morning. And so it's really obvious to us how differently terminology is used. And you see it in discussions throughout tech. Like, we all use a lot of terms very differently, and these things come up a lot in the news and media, in general discussion, and everybody has something different in their mind when they use words like these. It's important also to think about the fact in academia, not only does everybody use terms differently, but for terms like data and privacy and so on, everybody is kind of also in competition with each other to be the one to come up with the definition of what it is. So you end up with lots of competing definitions. So let's talk through some of these terms. Different sectors mean different things when they say AI. AI is one of the ones that's most obviously, like when you talk about AI and I talk about AI, we're talking about completely different things. When you use the term AI, are you talking about a trained model? Are you talking about an algorithm? Are you talking about an application that may incorporate a trained model or a complex system or optimization or humans pretending to be trained models? Are you just talking about the model itself? Or are you talking about the whole system it's involved in, the application, the testing processes, the training processes? It's very tempting, and I've spent a lot of time telling other people that they're using the term AI wrong. But that's not very useful. That doesn't help us understand what we're all saying and understanding when we use this word. What is useful is if we bear in mind that people don't magically understand the term AI the same as us, and we explain what we mean. Are we including the training aspect of it when we talk about AI? Are we including the entire system or just the math at the core? Also good to remember that not all data methods are AI. There's so many things that are done with data, and often the discussion is about AI ethics, when really they just mean data ethics. So what's data? In this talk, we're specifically discussing data by and about humans. You often find, especially in academic literature, things like the metadata of our digital lives, or even the text of our old blog post lying around on a server somewhere, are referred to as digital traces, as if there's something that's left behind, and to disconnect it from the people who created it, or who that data intimately describes. I've also heard data described as numbers with context. The context is one of the most important things to remember. So all data was written, generated, collected within a specific context. And like any sort of historical text, if you remove it from that context, you remove most of the meaning and use of that data. And for human data, part of that context is human lives. Here's the big one. What is ethics is not only a talk in itself, but many lifetimes, I think. So that's out of scope. I'm just going to talk about a few things that when the word ethics is thrown around, different people might think of when they hear that word. So in the context of philosophy, ethics may mean asking questions about how we decide what we do. In general conversation, people often use the word ethics to mean knowing what is right and wrong. And in the tech industry, when the term ethics is used, it often means let's maybe not hurt people quite as much as we've been hurting people in the past, or at least talk about maybe not hurting people quite as much as we've hurt people in the past. In the academic world, there's, of course, all the theoretical understandings of ethics, but often the term ethics simply refers to the formal process of university ethics review. So it's used for lots of different things. And specifically, the word ethics is used in conjunction with AI more and more and more and more. There's so many different documents and principles and frameworks that have been coming out around AI ethics in academia, in government, and in industry. There's over 84 public and private initiatives so far, just to kind of try and come up with some kind of codification or guidelines about ethics in AI, and that's just public and private. There's so many more academic papers out there. So what we're seeing here is a review done by the Harvard Principled AI Project, where they had a bit of a look, I'll zoom in a bit, at a bunch of different AI principles documents, and went and pulled out, categorized all the common themes that were in many, but not all, of these things. So these are all public and private documents. These are not like as in private industry or public institution like government institution. Produced documents, not academic papers, because there's so many more of those. So just for interest, the categories they came up with are human rights, promotion of human values, professional responsibility, human control of technology, fairness and non-discrimination, transparency and explainability, safety and security, accountability, and privacy. And you can have a closer look at the visualization at the URL there. But these are the common themes they've identified as being what people are talking about when they try and come up with AI ethics principles. Remember for later that it starts at human rights and it ends at privacy. So this brings us to privacy. So we have laws about privacy. In Australia, the big one is the Australian Privacy Act. Amelia explains it in a really nice way. She says the legislation is a framework, and we have ethics to fill the gaps in these frameworks. Because, of course, legislation is slow. That's how it works. We also have Australian privacy principles. If you haven't read them, I would recommend that. They're surprisingly readable. But it is, if you're looking at what applies to what you're doing, you do have to look up and check what applies. For example, for me, I work at a Queensland public university, so the Australian privacy principles doesn't apply to me, the Queensland privacy principles applies. But that's as a Queensland public institution. If I was at a private company in Queensland, the Australian privacy principles would apply. They're quite similar, at least like the overall shape of it. So if we have a look back at the Privacy Act, how is privacy defined in legislation? I'm not an expert in this. Amelia knows more than I do, but neither of us are lawyers. So it's primarily defined through the term personal information. And this in here is the definition of personal information for the Australian government. So it says, personal information means information or an opinion about an identified individual or an individual who is reasonably identifiable. A, whether the information or opinion is true or not, and B, whether the information or opinion is recorded in a material form or not. So this section is in like a big, basically glossary dictionary list of terms and definitions that is long and has some other interesting things to look at that are mostly very vague, like you can kind of see at the bottom here, the start of the definition of record, which I have questions about. And there's also a definition of sensitive information, which is important, but that's commonly repeated in a lot of different regulations around the place. There's, at the same time, not much and quite a lot to unpack in this definition. I find it difficult to find meaning in that. And it's especially difficult when dealing with the complexity of digital data systems as we know them today. Does it help us answer a question when we're looking at data that we want to collect or use, of whether that's private or public? Not really. Not really. Privacy is a human right. This is actually very exciting and very timely, because as of the 1st of January, 15 days ago today, Queensland has a Human Rights Act. So Queensland is the 3rd state in Australia to have introduced the Human Rights Act. It came into effect 15 days ago. And, very nicely, privacy is a human right, which is the next slide. Privacy is a human right. So there's a list of things that are human rights in Queensland, and one of them is privacy and reputation. So let's have a look at that. So this says, privacy and reputation. A person has the right, A, not to have the person's privacy, family, home, or correspondence unlawfully or arbitrarily interfered with, and B, not to have the person's reputation unlawfully attacked. Does it define privacy? No. And there isn't a handy glossary dictionary definition section elsewhere in the document that does that. It is very interesting to note that privacy is closely associated with reputation. It's not in there on its own. It's there with reputation, and it's connected rather inextricably to that. There's no specific mention here or in the other parts that I've read, I can't speak for the whole thing, about digital data and media. And unsurprisingly, considering the lack of specificity, there is a lot of debate and discussion going on right now about the implications and details of the Human Rights Act in general, but privacy in particular in the sort of context we're looking at. We're going to be seeing a lot of discussion about this and eventually a lot of people poking to try and find loopholes and work out what the barriers are, like what the exact things that they can do with data are. Whether or not they technically are going to be violations of human rights in Queensland. It's going to be interesting. So, does this help us answer whether something we're looking at is private or public? Nope. But it does tell us that it's really important to figure that out. The context of data matters. It matters a lot. We mentioned that before. Context is what gives data meaning. So we have to look at data in context because that context informs what we can and should and all of those other words do with that data. So practically speaking, when looking at how you might structure or use or collect data, you need to look at legislation and other requirements. So we've already had a bit of a look at legislation, but there's a lot of institutional requirements and other things that may apply, especially in some sectors have a lot more regulation than others. So you need to work out what applies to you. You need to look at the type of data that you've got, what medium it's in. Is it primary data that you are collecting directly from people? Is it secondary data that someone else has collected from people and you're using from them? Is it data that you have inferred or calculated from data that somebody else has collected? All those things affect the context of the data that you're working with. And so you need to know how that affects what is appropriate to do with it. What are the contextual expectations around the data? So what does society expect about how you might use data? What does somebody who you are collecting data from expect about how you might use that data? And the thing that makes it even more complicated, but also more interesting and real, is that this changes over time. So even the meaning of the words private and public changes over time. Our understanding of what privacy is can change drastically over years and very, very drastically over generations. And also a single event can change things from, oh yeah, that's fine to share that, to, oh, that's a bit dangerous, maybe we shouldn't have done that. Also, the appropriateness of sharing specific data can change over time. So you might have something that can be publicly shared at one point, but then after a period of time, after an event, after something, it's then only appropriate to share it with certain people. And then maybe at some other point in future, it might be something that would be publicly shareable again. So you have to do the best you can to understand that and how things might change over time and record it so that you can follow those changes appropriately. So I'm going to go through a specific example in the context that I work, which is social media data reuse, because privacy is complicated on social media. We all know that social media data is used for a variety of purposes by various parties. The social media platforms use it for their own use. Other businesses use it for advertising or market research. There's academic research, including both social science, computational science, and all kinds of other fields. There's government surveillance. There's malicious intent. And the lines between all of these things are quite often blurry. So social media is used a lot for things that a lot of people go, oh, that's maybe not an appropriate use of data. And there's a lot of reasons for that. We use social media a lot. It's very present in our lives. It's very easy to access and use the data. This is also why some platforms are more commonly used than others. It's trendy. There are a lot of industries built around the reuse of social media data. It's often seen as a fun challenge, especially things like linking data between different platforms and services. It's a puzzle. We like puzzles. And what I think about a lot is that it's really mixed up in the whole AI insights myth, that by throwing arbitrary people's personal information into some mathematical model we've trained in a way we can't reproduce, we're somehow providing profound insights into humanity. It's seen as a wealth of information that's there for the taking by many people, to be easily converted into financial wealth with some fancy machine learning or a shiny dashboard. So that's why it's in the news a lot. But to focus on academic research, what I'm saying is all based on my observation in doing research on ethical issues in academic research use of social media data and the best practices for how to do that. So as mentioned earlier, ethics review is a formal process in academic institutions. And practically speaking, at its core is risk management. So it's not just about making sure what someone wants to do will do no harm. It's more that you are aware of what harms it can do and are doing everything you can to mitigate those harms, and that you can justify that the benefits outweigh the risks. Specifics vary between institutions, and norms, common practices, and risk appetites vary considerably between fields. Twitter in particular is often used as the data is very easy to access in large quantity. Twitter's terms are relatively permissive for research and other usage, and Twitter's privacy model is quite simple. For those of you who don't use Twitter, so the privacy model of Twitter is you have a Twitter account. That Twitter account is either public or private. If it's public, anyone can see any of your tweets. They don't have to be logged into Twitter to see your tweets. If it's a private account, then people have to be logged into Twitter to see your tweets, and only people who are logged into Twitter accounts that you have given explicit permission to see your tweets can see your tweets, and then they can see all of your tweets. The one complicating thing is that people can change whether their account is public or private at any time, and this also affects the visibility of all old tweets. Until recent years, public tweets were largely seen by researchers as fair game. They're public. You can do what you want with them. But over the past years, many researchers have come to realize that maybe that's not the best way to look at things. There's a lot of discussion about this that's been going on, a lot of ideas, and there's no one best practice. There's really, really differing opinions around the place. So I'm going to tell you about social media data and privacy as I understand it. So if we ask, is social media data public or private? Even if it's technically public, it was shared with the expectation of a certain context. For me, I had like a really kind of light bulb moment when I started working with researchers who research Twitter data. I've been using Twitter very actively since 2008. It's my main social media. I consider myself pretty well informed about information security and privacy. I've always been careful and had some hard rules about what I do and don't share online. And I was pretty comfortable about the way I use Twitter and what I shared on Twitter. But then once I saw my tweets in the databases and the data sets that the researchers were using, even though it was interesting research, and that was all fine, I felt a little bit uncomfortable. And I found myself changing the way I tweeted. I was second-guessing everything before I posted it. I ended up not posting quite a lot of things that I would have posted previously. And then over the course of the year or so since then, I've started kind of forgetting that more and more. Like, I still know, but it's no longer at the forefront of my mind. So I'm gone a bit back to my old habits. That's my personal experience. So when you post something on social media, you know if it's public that other people can see it, but you post it with the idea that your friends, your little community, you're writing it for them. It's really hard to write it for them and then also maintain the like third-party data services and researchers as other audiences in the back of your mind. I'm not good at doing that. That's hard. One thing that people love to do with social media data is inferring personal information. So can we do that? That's bad. That's very dangerous. It's very easy to cause harm. When I say inferring personal information, I mean you look at somebody's social media profile, all the things that they've posted, and you try and extract some knowledge about them that they have not explicitly said. And the thing that makes this extra dangerous is people often do this about like protected characteristics. So in all that Australian legislation, there's a list of protected characteristics, things like sexuality, membership of a union, things like that. Those are the kinds of things that people like to infer from people's social media profiles. So that's quite dangerous. So if we ask, do we have to get consent for this? That's really tricky. Social media data is often used at scales where you can't. Which in an academic context, there's a process for that. You can, there is conditions for being able to get a waiver of consent in your ethics application, and a lot of social media research meets those conditions. But if you're doing it at smaller scales where people are more easily identifiable, then things get tricky. And things get extra tricky if you've done a whole bunch of data analysis and now you want to share some tweets as representative of that data set in your publications. Then maybe you do have to ask for consent when you didn't before. So it's not an impossible issue, but you do have to figure out what you're going to do about consent. And then there's the issue of, can we just anonymize it all so that we don't have to worry about everything else? In this case, no. Social media data is not anonymizable, not on a granular level, especially if you're sharing text of posts, because you can just paste it into a search engine and you know who it's from immediately. There are other kinds of data where anonymization can work, but as we see more and more re-identifiability horror stories, maybe we need to think more about what we're trying to do when we anonymize data and whether it's actually going to protect people. So is social media data private or public? It's kind of both. People understand risk and benefit in very different ways. Risk is such an important concept that in academia, when you apply for ethics approval, you must clearly state how the research is beneficial and how you mitigate risk. There are also different processes you must undertake if you work with at-risk populations. For example, when Amelia does ethnographic research, privacy and confidentiality is a key requirement to mitigate risk or harm. This may include the use of pseudonyms, never mentioning the location of field sites, and making sure that all participants can withdraw from research at any time. It's also important to recognize issues around digital inclusion and digital literacy. Not everyone has the same level of access, and this changes people's perception of risks. And if you want to think through how different people see risks differently, my health record is the best example we've got going around right now. Everybody thinks of my health record slightly differently and is worried about different risks around my health record. Privacy is also a cultural concept. Our white colonial Australian culture has certain expectations around privacy that may not be present in other cultures. But more fundamentally, the whole concept of information and the sharing of information and who has ownership, right to access, use, or share information can be completely different in different cultures. And we have to bear that in mind as we work, especially when we work with data at scale, because we may not even know what cultures the people who own this data come from. Another interesting example is cultural maps. So cultural maps are a tool or technique that document both tangible and intangible cultural heritage. An example of tangible cultural heritage might be like a historic building or traditional clothing. Well, intangible cultural heritage are non-physical things such as songs and language or customs. So cultural maps are a thing that developed in response to traditional mapping processes that were static and representative of colonial understandings of land. Cultural maps can be anything. They can be a picture, they can be a drama performance, they can be a website. So I'm just going to show you an example. Neither Amelia or I are involved in this. We just think it's a nice example. So this is the Warloman website. It is a project to mobilize song archives to nourish an endangered Aboriginal language. So this is about the Noongar language, I mispronounced that, which is from the southwest of Australia. So this website has a number of interviews with people that are available for people to watch, their videos. Some of the interviews are just on the website, anybody can watch them. And some of them are individually password protected. What's quite interesting is there is a list of names, being the names of the people who are interviewed. And everyone can see the list of names. So you just can't see the actual interview itself. There's a committee listed on the project website who oversee the project. Not being involved in this project, I don't know exactly what the process of gaining access to the protected videos are, but you can imagine that there's a few different ways. It could be the committee, but more likely that you may have to get permission from the individual who's listed themselves to see the video. So they would be able to make the decision about who would be able to watch that. So for Warloman, the question is a two-step one. It's, is this public? If not, who can see it? In general, can we answer the question yet of whether the data we're looking at is private or public? Probably not really, because it's not a yes or no question. I hope we're all seeing that. And if we just ask this one question, we are limiting the nuance of human information sharing. So how do we learn to do better? There's a lot of discussion of technical solutions out there, and I think you're probably in this talk if you think that maybe it's not an exclusively technical solution that we need. It's also important to involve looking at processes, looking at governance, rather than a purely technical solution. The technical solutions are just the implementations of the policies and the processes that we put together. We need to be really, really wary of buzzword ethics. That's a big thing. I didn't save it, I wish I had. I saw a tweet a little while back where someone was talking about a company being so excited they're introducing having a chief ethics officer. I don't know how that's supposed to work. How can ethics be just one person's responsibility? Ethical decision-making needs to be incorporated into all decisions, into all processes at all levels. It's something that we all have to do together, and it's a process. It's not, do we have ethics? Yes, no, tick the box. It's a journey. A lot of the questions that we need to ask in order to go on this journey have already been codified into data management processes. So It's quite useful to have a look at the resources that are already out there about data management. I recommend you have a look at Claire Reeler's talk from yesterday in the GLAM mini conference about data management and cultural appropriation for some more specifics around some of those aspects. It's also really important to, in order to learn about how to do better, it's a matter of discussion. And that's why we're here. That's what we're doing at this conference. That's why the theme is who's watching. That's why there's so many talks about privacy at this conference this week. It's a matter of education, educating ourselves, educating others, and sharing what we're learning. And it's a matter of listening. We have to develop better engagement between the tech industry, academia, and government. This conversation is happening in all of these three things in lots of different pockets, in all kinds of places. And we're all kind of like doing the same work and not talking to each other. Or some of us are trying, but it's really hard because there's so many institutional barriers separating out these sectors. We need more, like we've got so many talks about this conference about data and privacy. It's awesome. We need to keep doing this. For exploration of a common and concrete use case, if that's what you're after, I'm looking forward to seeing Opal's talk tomorrow about collecting information with care. So let's have a look at this again. Is it private or public? This is a closed question. It expects a yes or a no, a true or a false, an on or an off. Privacy isn't an on-off switch. It's not just like one little tick box. So we need to ask open questions instead. And there's a lot of open questions we need to ask, but there's two core ones that I'd like to suggest as a starting point if you're wondering where to go from here. Who does this belong to, and how do they want it to be shared? Thank you. I think we have time for a couple of questions. Yep. Questions, not comments, please.
Okay, cool. Hey, thank you so much for your talk. I'm just quite curious about how you feel we can adequately describe and explain this journey to younger people. So oftentimes I'm working with 12 to 15-year-olds and trying to give them the type of language and understanding over this. I'd love your thoughts on how we could more effectively communicate to that type of age bracket around what privacy means.
That's a good question. I guess it is just, I don't have answers, but I don't think there are answers. I think it's talking and listening and asking questions. Ask them what makes them uncomfortable. Like I know I spend a lot of time with like 10 and up girls. I'm a Girl Guide leader, and they use the internet and share things differently than I do, but they do have their own rules and systems. They're a bit different than the way I see things. So I think that we do have a place to start from, which is asking them how they make decisions now, and then going from there. That's where I'd start. Does that help? It does, thank you.
Thanks, Betsy. Were there any permanent changes to how you used your Twitter? You said that you stopped thinking so much about the research context that you saw your tweets in, but were there any permanent changes that you've made since?
I think I still use Twitter a little bit differently, but definitely not as much differently. I've stopped thinking about, I no longer, every time I press send, imagine it in a database. Only sometimes. I still don't think that, I still wouldn't change anything that I said in the past. Like, I still think that the boundaries that I set myself were appropriate. I just no longer think about it all the time, so it doesn't make me uncomfortable, because just forgetting about things and not paying attention to things is a very relevant topic where privacy is concerned.
I wanted to ask a little bit more about what you think of the ethics of linking data to demonstrate inference of sensitive characteristics or other things about the person. So I did quite a lot of work with some colleagues at the University of Melbourne on this. Specifically, we re-identified a very large, very detailed data set that the Commonwealth Department of Health had published online without asking anybody. And we did not ask permission of the people we re-identified before we took the public information about them and tried to look at whether we could use that to identify them in the health data set. Obviously, this is a very dicey ethical issue. Obviously, it's totally inappropriate to peer into their records, misuse the data, publish identifiable data, and so forth. So we decided that the right thing to do was tell the department and encourage them to tell all 2.5 million people whose data they'd published, which they refused to do. My question to you is, in practice, what would you advise as the ethical way to go forward? To me, it seemed that there was an ethical obligation to make it known how easily identifiable the data was. And it was not in practice possible to ask people in advance if it was okay if we used their public tweets or public, whatever, Facebook posts as examples. Because part of it is you don't even know who's identifiable until you've spent 6 weeks hunting through public information to see what's there. So in practice, what would you do?
I don't know. That's really hard. That's a really hard position to be in. I think that what you did in telling the department, that was necessary because they have to know that what they're doing is dangerous. Beyond that, though, that's really difficult. And that's where, I guess, this is something that I've been trying to think through but haven't really got in, like, wordable forms. There's really different, there's different ethical issues and different approaches for research, and for things like journalism, and for things like when you have to share and disclose. There's different contexts and different approaches, and different things are appropriate. And I'm not quite sure how to define or balance that. That is a tricky one, and what your situation is kind of in the middle of a few different things there. I think ultimately we need better regulation and legislation so that they're held to the fact that they've been shown this is re-identifiable. They have to do something about it. Because if they've been told and they don't do something about it, that's a problem. That's all I've got for you. But that's a really interesting conversation to continue to have for all of us.
One last question. Anyone? Ooh.
So I can see this as a sort of process for ethics approval and deciding how to do it. But I'd see that the legislation and regulation is a really hairy thing, and both a university and business, once they've come up with the
What is the question?
How do you know that you're not going to get in trouble later on?
You don't. Everything changes. You could always get in trouble. Things change. You just got to do the best that you can with what you have at the time, right? But doing the best that you can means listening to people and doing the research, not just going, ooh, there's data. I can do things. Does that? Yeah, you've just got to listen and try. Yeah, that's the answer.
Just one sec. Please accept this token of appreciation on behalf of Linux.conf.
Thank you.
Join me in one more round of applause for Betsy.